cloud. All right, Jason. So how about just to start off, we go around the room and everyone can just let you know who's here. I'll start. Evan Wilkin, I work at FEDC.
Jim Sackett with the Governor's Office.
Roger Burgraff.
Mike Prox.
Clark Milne with Dowell and AMA. Jason.
Hi, Clark.
John Ringstad. Mike Big, City of Fairbanks.
Michelle Hallowell, Interior Gas Utility.
Bill Clemenson.
Barbara Barnes with Representative Wilson's office.
Mike Kraft.
Jeannie Olson, Citizen.
David Prusak with Stantec.
All right, and welcome to the weekly Energy for All Alaskans meeting at 8:03 a.m. We have Commissioner Brune. Jason W. Brune is Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. Prior to this, Mr. Brune was the Senior Director of Land and Resources at Cook Inlet Region Corporation, where he oversaw the development and administration of CIRI's 1.6 million acres of subsurface resources, including oil, gas, minerals, sand and gravel, and coal. In addition to supervising the team's staff and environmental contractors, providing stakeholder management and overseeing relevant legal reviews, he worked to identify priorities for addressing contaminated lands. Commissioner Brune has also worked for Anglo American, where he served as the company's Public Affairs and Government Relations Manager, and for the Resource Development Council, where he served as Executive Director. Additionally, he has served on the Alaska Sea Life Center Board, Cook Inlet Beluga Whale Endangered Species Act Recovery Team, Hyonek Tribal Conservation District Board, the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Public Advisory Committee, and numerous other business and civic organizations. Commissioner Brune holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Carleton College and performed his graduate study in environmental science at Alaska Pacific University. And with that, I think we can get started. It's all yours.
Thank you, Evan, and good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect. Wow, this is a great use of technology. I appreciate everyone coming out this morning. And obviously, I was there a couple of weeks ago for the unveiling of another thing that started with P, and that was PM 2.5. I'll be back in a couple of weeks for our public hearings on the and open houses on the 25th and 26th of June. So if I don't have answers to questions that you may ask today, I'll do my best to get them for you by that point. To that end, since I can't see you, Evan or any of the folks that are there, if you have questions, don't hesitate to interrupt me at any point. You won't hurt my feelings at all, and try to get the questions answered. I'm trying to control the screen, but it's not letting me right now, Evan.
It says waiting for Jason to control your screen.
It was working
Yeah,
earlier.
is there an option to accept it again?
I'll check one more time.
There you go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you. So today's presentation is about another P word, PFAS. What does PFAS stand for? It's been in the news a lot. It's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. For short, it's a lot easier to say PFAS. PFAS are man-made compounds that were developed in the 40s by 3M. They're used everywhere. They are water, oil, heat resistant. They have, like I said, they're used in many things that we use on a daily basis. I'll get into that in a little bit. There's over 5,000 PFAS out there. And the two most common that are studied are known as PFOS, which is perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, and PFOA, which is perfluorooctanoic acid. Again, easier to say PFOS and PFOA, and it's important to differentiate when I say PFAS. That's the full classification of over 5,000 man-made chemicals, and the PFOS and PFOA are the two specific types of them. These chemicals are very persistent in the environment. They do not break down, and some of them bioaccumulate. So, as I was saying, we've all used PFAS. In fact, you'd be shocked at how much we use them. Most of you have probably heard of Scotchgard. PFAS were used as the key ingredient in Scotchgard, and that, of course, is used to treat fabric, carpets, and such, and make them water and stain resistant. PFAS chemicals are also found in such things as non-stick cookware, Teflon, in wrappers that you get from fast food restaurants, certain types of dental flosses, clothing that you might wear, like Gore-Tex, and much more. It is ubiquitous in our environment. It can be found everywhere. We all have it in our bodies. And ingestion of PFAS occurs from just use of everyday consumer products that contain the PFAS. And again, the reason why they're so prevalent is because they work very, very well, and they are used for stain, oil, and water resistance. So other areas that they're used in our environment, the part you'll probably hear the most about is the aqueous film forming foam, or also known as AFFF. I'll get into that a little more detail later. Of course, PFAS chemicals are being found in the wastewater treatment plants. Recently, we've heard about biosolids application through Golden Heart Utilities. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Of course, the leachate that comes from landfills. And while this isn't entirely prevalent in Alaska, there is, in the lower 48, significant manufacturing of PFAS chemicals. And so there's, as far as I know, none of that occurring, no manufacturing of PFAS chemicals occurring in Alaska, but there are impacts in the lower 48 from that such manufacturing. So as I indicated, the AFFF, or aqueous film forming foam, every certified airport in Alaska, and indeed the United States, is required by the FAA to have AFFF on hand, and not just to have it, but to test it on an annual basis. And again, AFFF, the reason why it's required at every airport is because it works to save lives. It works to put out high temperature fires and save property. As I indicated, this AFFF is required to be tested on an annual basis. Recently, though, Commissioner McKinnon made the decision that we would no longer test this. And this is the reason why that we've stopped testing it in Alaska. And of course, even though it's required by the FAA, is because they found that when this stuff is tested, many communities throughout Alaska have grown up near the airports, and they have their drinking water supplies, the groundwater, in close proximity, the wells that they drill. And this AFFF gets into the ground, and it impacts it. It gets into the water. And obviously that, with the people getting their drinking water from the wells close to the airport, they've found that their water is contaminated with the PFAS chemicals, and obviously that people don't want their water to be impacted by that. So I'll get into a little more detail about the airports around the state later on, but it's that's the predominant way contamination has occurred in Alaska. So, as I indicated, the most common source of exposure to PFAS, for humans at least, is through the consumption of contaminated food and water. Although, like I said, household products can also contribute to a person's PFAS exposure to a lesser extent. The exposure can occur through many pathways, including, like I said, eating foods that were wrapped or stored in PFAS packaging, preparing foods in Teflon or other non-stick bakeware, consuming fish caught in PFAS-contaminated waters, of course, consuming crops that were grown in industrial contaminated soil, soils that may have been mixed with biosolids or the compost made from biosolids, or soil that has been irrigated with contaminated water can also lead to PFAS exposure for the animals that are eating, that are grazing near it. One specific example I think is important to point out is in New Mexico, over 4,000 dairy cattle were recently put down because they found that the water that they had been drinking, the irrigation that had been used in close proximity to that dairy farm, had been contaminated with PFAS. And the cattle took it into their systems and then ultimately expressed it in the milk they were getting from those cattle. So those 4,000 cattle ultimately had to be put down and that milk had to be destroyed. As I indicated, to my knowledge, the primary source of the contamination in Alaska, the water contamination, has come from the use of the AFFF. Once it is discharged into the environment, these chemicals quickly partition to nearby surface and groundwater supplies. The PFAS chemicals themselves, they're found everywhere. They're ubiquitous in our environment, as I indicated. They're not only being found to be entering the waterways, they're also being atmospherically transported. And not surprisingly, higher PFAS levels are found in urban areas, especially near, of course, areas where they're being manufactured. Over 99% of the people, of Americans that have been tested, their bloods have been tested have found PFAS levels in their blood. Indeed, they've even found PFAS in polar bear blood samples. That's interesting and important to point out because obviously the polar bears aren't using Teflon pans or eating Scotchgard carpets. They're eating seals that have eaten fish that had ultimately been exposed to PFAS in one way or the other. So it is bioaccumulating, and as you go up the trophic levels, chemicals like that tend to bioaccumulate in higher levels for animals on top of the food chain. So that's intriguing, obviously, that they found PFAS in polar bear blood samples. So what are the health effects of PFAS? There's obviously evidence that exposure to PFAS can lead to adverse health outcomes in humans, as well as animals. As I indicated, if humans or animals have ingested such PFAS chemicals by either eating them or eating off of things that were had PFAS in them, the PFAS can be absorbed. It can accumulate in the body. The PFAS chemicals can stay in the body for long periods of time, and indeed they can ultimately increase to the point where it can have impacts to humans and cause adverse health effects. Some of the studies that have show that high concentrations, and for the most part, as I indicated before, where the most study has been is on the PFOS and PFOA. That's where Alaska is putting all of its attention to those two specific PFAS chemicals. And so those two high concentrations of those have been found to cause reproductive and developmental impacts, liver and kidney and immunological effects in laboratory animals. The PFOA and PFOS have caused tumors in animal studies. for the most part, the most consistent findings from human studies have shown that increased cholesterol levels among exposed populations. But they've also found impacts to infant birth weights, adverse impacts on the immune system. PFOA has been shown to have cancer impacts, and PFOS have shown to have thyroid hormone effects. And as you can see on the screen, a number of other potential impacts as well. There have been a number of epidemiological studies that have been done. Effectively, PFAS chemicals are not as easy as, say, smoking when it comes to smoking gun per se for cancers or for other health impacts. However, these epidemiological studies on humans have shown that there are significant effects from different PFAS types. Again, the two on the two left columns there, PFOA and PFOS, are the ones that Alaska is focusing its efforts on because that's what the most is known about. I think that quote by the ATSDR director is very profound. The science around these compounds is emerging rapidly. And so almost as we establish a benchmark, in a matter of months, it may be out of date based on the new science. That I think is important to point out, that this is an emerging issue. This is, there's new science happening every day on this. We are watching this very closely at DEC and at HES at the state of Alaska. Of course, we're following the lead of the EPA, and they're working closely with ATSDR at the federal level and paying very close attention to the potential health impacts of this. So one of the challenges facing regulatory agencies is that a lot of what we do know about the health impacts is coming from studies that have been done in highly exposed communities, those communities that I mentioned before that may have, where the manufacturing of these chemicals occurred. I think an example of that, the Ohio River Valley, where near DuPont, where many of these were manufactured. Many of the newer studies provide results that are more representative of exposure to the general population. But there is, as I indicated before, an inherent degree of uncertainty associated with those epidemiological studies due to the number of factors that can skew the results. Some of those factors might be different environmental factors, genetics, demographics, and of course other social determinants of health. In Alaska, and in fact, just from a nationwide perspective, in the early 90s, I'm going to give a little background of PFAS and incorporate some of the Alaskan impacts in the next few slides. The 90s were when the studies began to find PFAS in the general population. As I indicated, over 99% of the general population does have PFAS in it. In the early 2000s, 3M started phasing out the production of PFOS. And EPA started issuing regs limiting the use of PFOS. In 2006, EPA's began to try to phase out the long chain PFAS use. Again, I said there's over 5,000 PFAS chemicals. Those are different length chains. The really long chains are the ones that are showing to not break down in the environment and to bioaccumulate. In 2009, the EPA published their provisional health advisory levels of 200 parts per trillion. That's the PPT for PFOS, and 400 PPT for PFOA. In 2012 to 2015, the EPA required public drinking water systems to monitor for 6 PFAS chemicals in their UCMR3 process. At that point, or soon thereafter, the U.S. started to phase out PFOA production. And it was around that time then that Eielson, up obviously in your neck of the woods, and Moose Creek found PFOS and PFOA in the drinking water. EPA established a lifetime health advisory, also called LHA, that's the vernacular, of 70 PPT for PFOA and PFOS. Around that time, or just prior to that, DEC established groundwater cleanup levels of 400 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS, and they also set soil cleanup levels. At that time, the Fairbanks Regional Fire Training Center was found to have PFAS from obviously the training that occurred in the drinking water wells in close proximity. 2017, the International Airport, PFAS was found in drinking water wells. DEC at that time was active. The regs that DEC had published in 2016 led us to issue letters and fact sheets to, sorry about that extra T in government, government officials on the use of AFFF. There was last year in 2018, EPA held a national summit about a year ago. DEC then issued a technical memo in August setting a interim 70 parts per trillion action level for 5 specific PFAS. And soon thereafter, Gustavus was found at PFAS in their drinking water wells associated with the airport in that area. And DEC issued draft regulations and began to take comments on those with the comment period ending in November. Those regs were never finalized with the Walker administration, and so they were left on my desk when I took on this role. As I indicated, in 2018, DEC had put that PFAS action plan in place. They worked very closely with the Department of Transportation to identify potential areas that may have been impacted from the use of AFFF. We, of course, also wanted to prioritize those areas where the PFAS exposure may have occurred. And so that's not just in the areas where the airports were, but also the landfills and the use of in the leachate at the landfills and at the wastewater utilities. Both Fairbanks and Kodiak have composting of their biosolids. So that was some areas that we thought may potentially have impacts from AFFF, or excuse me, from PFAS. In 2019, as I'm sure you've all read in the paper, we as a state made the decision to put those regs, those draft regs that have been proposed in the Walker administration on the shelf, and to align ourselves with the Environmental Protection Agency's approach for focusing on 70 parts per trillion for the combination of PFOS and PFOA. And so we did put those regs on hold, but we did continue to test the airports and, of course, the water in and the surface water of lakes in close proximity to PFAS contamination. And so at that point, we did test some fish at Kimberly Lake and Polaris Lake, and we did find elevated PFAS levels in the fish from Kimberly Lake. The Polaris Lake, both were closed to fishing because of known AFFF discharge near there. At that time, also, or recently, about a few weeks ago, Golden Heart Utilities issued a press release and indicated that they had found high levels of PFOS and PFOA in their compost that was on site. they were very proactive, and I think significant kudos needs to go to Golden Heart for looking to see if there was contamination in their biosolids. We do not know whether or not historic distribution of those compost materials had PFAS in them, but if there are concerns that folks have, you can get your groundwater tested. There's a link on DEC's website. The Golden Heart Utilities in their press release did put a link to that as well. And the thing that's great about this is this is very treatable with respect to the water systems. You can get carbon filtration technologies, reverse osmosis, and other methods that can clean your water systems if you are concerned that there might be an impact. As I indicated with respect to the Fairbanks Airport contamination and the Eielson contamination, there's also contamination associated with the previous Williams Flint Hills refinery and the sulfolane. There's also PFAS contamination associated with that. Many of those areas have been given alternative drinking water supplies. The Department of Transportation, the Fairbanks Airport, the Department of Defense have all provided alternative drinking water as the responsible parties. We also, about 9 to 10 years ago, started doing we test our fish throughout the state for different kind of environmental contaminants. These fish tissue samples, as you see, were collected in 2009 and 2010. They were analyzed for PFAS and other chemicals. The general protocols that were used in collecting them, though, they did not find high levels of PFAS in any of these taken 10 years ago. However, where they did find them, in 5% of them, there was concern that because our raincoats, the Gore-Tex, the things that we wear have PFAS chemicals in them, the protocol for collecting those fish may not have known that the exposure, that the PFAS could have come from, not from the fish themselves, but from the clothing or the bags or the things that the fish were put in. So new protocols have been developed to ensure that the PFAS levels, if there are in fish, that the testing that's being done is making sure that they're not being exposed through those that are handling the fish. So with respect to how the whole process works for finding responsible parties that may have led to PFAS contamination and what our roles are, I think it's important for this group to know what the state agency roles and coordination is. DEC normally will work with the responsible parties so that they ensure that contamination is properly characterized, the plumes are identified, how the extent of how far the contamination may occur. And we work very closely, as I said, with the responsible parties. And most of the cases with the AFFF, it has been the Department of Transportation because they own and operate the airports. But there have been other entities, like I said, the Department of Defense, the Fairbanks International Airport, Alyeska Pipeline, did find some PFAS contamination at the Nordale Yard, though it wasn't at levels over 70 parts per trillion. It was not at levels that. So, but DC, we do have a statutory requirement to seek cost recovery from responsible parties for our oversight and our costs. So, I guess an example to point out is the airport in Gustavus did have contamination from the Department of Transportation and their operation of the airport. However, the community of Gustavus received a fire engine, and they used that several miles away from the airport to put out a fire. Well, that fire engine, of course, the way they put out the fire, it contained AFFF, and that ultimately led to significant contamination in that area. And so the community of Gustavus became a responsible party, and we are working with them. But that's the way CERCLA and state law works for identifying responsible parties. It is the entity that ultimately caused the contamination that is responsible for delineating and ultimately leading to cleanup. We work very closely with HES and of course other agencies to respond to the public health concerns and the questions that exist over exposure to contaminated drinking water, of course potential uptake that may occur in produce that people grow or in fish or wildlife. HES it participates in public meetings, they develop fact sheets, and they do a significant number of health consultations, and their website's very good for information that and questions people may have. The Department of Transportation, as I indicated, they've worked very closely with us in prioritizing the airports, the state airports that may have been impacted. Again, huge kudos to Commissioner McKinnon, who, again, FAA requires AFFF to be at all of these airports, but he has stopped the testing of the AFFF. They have been working very closely in making sure that alternative drinking water is given to any communities that have had releases of or AFFF and PFAS chemicals found in drinking water supplies. They have been giving alternative drinking water. Of course, the community of Fairbanks has, as I indicated before, also provided alternative drinking water. So the PRPs, the responsible parties, focus on making sure that the drinking water, either putting in systems that treat the water or giving them other sources of drinking water, that's a priority for DOT and other responsible parties. We work very closely, of course, with risk management and the Department of Administration with respect to claims that may come against the state in providing the financial ability for the state to provide that alternative drinking water and ultimately do the cleanup. And of course, we work very closely with the Department of Fish and Game to evaluate the potential impacts to fish. The contaminated sites that we have in Alaska, of course, you all are aware, as I indicated, Eielson Air Force Base, Moose Creek, Fairbanks and North Pole, Gustavus, Dillingham, King Salmon, Yakutat, and Uktiavik or Barrow. 366 drinking water wells have been found to have contamination, which is approximately 13,000 individuals. 5 airports in the state of Alaska, former fire training facility, a number of local government impacts, and of course private impacts. As I indicated, Alyeska, the North Pole Refinery, and others. So when the sites are discovered, this is just the full contaminated site response process. The site needs to be characterized, discovered what the impact is, how big it is, how did it get there, where it might be going, is it affecting drinking water. Then the determination has to be made on to, of course, stop the source, prevent additional exposure, and get to the cleanup and monitoring phase. So with respect to PFAS, we really haven't begun the cleanup phase. And indeed, they're still trying to figure out how to do that on a nationwide level. There was some cleanup done on Eielson. Significant soil was excavated, and it was sitting there. And when I took this role, I was told by Representative Wilson and by folks at the base that they wanted to ship all of that contaminated soil down to Oregon. And I didn't think that that was appropriate. I don't like the idea of exporting our pollution, exporting our problems to other jurisdictions. I think we need to deal with them ourselves. And so I worked to develop a test case with OIT to try to burn that contaminated soil. The reason it's a test case is these PFAS chemicals, the reason they work so well at putting out fires is because they don't break down at very high temperatures. So in order to do a test case for getting rid of this soil, you have to burn that soil at even higher temperatures, extremely high temperatures. And we have to monitor out the stack to ensure that we're not burning the soil and allowing the PFAS chemicals to go out the stack and be deposited down the air shed. So we're doing a test case with OIT, and hopefully we'll be able to find a local solution to that local problem, create some jobs, and eliminate the contaminated soil. Other areas around the state that have been exposed.
Mr. Brune, we have a question real quick.
Yeah, sure.
Mr. Brune, what's the procedure for cleaning the soil that they're using in the lower 48, and how does that differ from what you're proposing here?
You know, this is an emerging issue right now. The predominantly nationwide, worldwide, in fact, what's being done is just identification and alternative drinking water supplies given. What they did on Eielson was just excavate the contaminated soil and put it in a pile. This is the results that we get from this test burn with OIT are going to be used nationwide. People are still trying to figure out how to deal with this. So I would say that the lower 48 is doing nothing different really than what we're doing. We're trying to figure out how to get rid of this stuff.
I was just curious because you said they were gonna ship it down to the lower 48.
Oh, right. Sorry. Thank you. I see what you're saying. They were just going to put it in a landfill or a monofill.
Oh, okay. So they weren't gonna clean it. They were gonna sequester it.
They were just going to sequester it. Which, I mean, for a lot of contamination, that is an option. As long as you could put institutional controls on areas to ensure that there isn't further impacts to the environment, that it's not continuing to spread, and that people aren't going to be using that groundwater for drinking. That often is how contaminated sites are dealt with institutional controls. However, that certain areas, that's not an option. So you're right, they will have to ultimately clean up. At the Department of Defense had to, in order to build that, they had to excavate that soil. And then, you know, they want to get rid of that soil, understandably, but what to do with it, that's still definitely an emerging issue.
On that point, Jason, two thoughts. PFAS is not defined as a hazardous material at this time.
Go ahead.
Since it's not, we don't have any hazardous material sites, what by that I mean storage sites in Alaska, and it would be very difficult to create them. The citizens of Alaska would deny that. But the sequestering point, is it very leachable out of soils, or is it primarily the water that is the problem? Therefore,
absolutely, it's leachable. I mean, that's part of the concern when you have high levels in your soils in your yard. That's one of the concerns people may have if they had used significant amounts of, if it had been contaminated, of the compost from Golden Heart Utilities. And again, we don't know that previous years' batches of the compost were contaminated with PFAS, but the water, drinking water, and the wells ultimately get contaminated through leaching through contaminated soils.
Sir, Mike Meeks, City of Fairbanks. Good talking to you again. You know, last year we spent $5 million because of our fire training center. Just for a FYI, the Golden Heart Utilities is sitting on City of Fairbanks leased property. The building that's sitting there is a City of Fairbanks leased building. And I understand why Golden Heart did it, but they were significantly below any type of cleanup standard. So my concern is that we have a lot of people who are doing what is the right thing, but it might turn out to be a very expensive thing that did not need to be done. Question is, can we expect definitive EPA guidance on these issues in a matter of months, or is it going to be a matter of years?
It's a great question, and it's one that one of my future slides is going to address, but I'll just say that we stepped back and ultimately made the decision, and I've taken grief for it, but to follow the lead of the EPA. And in my conversations that we've had with the EPA, we have told the EPA that they need to act expeditiously on this. They are currently through their they put a PFAS plan together. They were taking comments on it up until yesterday. And they are evaluating putting PFOS and PFOA as contaminants under CERCLA. They are, which is the Superfund law. They are evaluating setting MCLs, which are maximum contaminant levels for PFAS chemicals. They're evaluating a lot of things. They obviously have the resources and the ability to make these kind of decisions. And so while you are correct that, so the state of Alaska still does have regs on the books at the, from 2016 for 400 parts per trillion. And we have a revised technical memo which focuses on 70 parts per trillion, at the same as the EPA, the Lifetime Health Advisory. So those are areas that where cleanup will have to occur. But it's incredibly important that the EPA act expeditiously on this so that they can give guidance to the 35 plus states who have done nothing. Alaska is out in front of most states on this issue. Most states aren't doing anything. We have regulations on the books from 2016. We have a technical memo out there that's focusing on the Lifetime Health Advisory level. And this is an issue that is definitely evolving on a daily basis. We're monitoring it all the time. I probably spend 50% of my time working on PFAS related issues in the last few months. And so as things continue to get learned, Mike, we will definitely be in touch with the impacted parties. And if you have suggestions or recommendations for us, please feel free to send them my way.
Thank you, sir.
And we have one more question.
Yeah, Jason, Jean Olson here. I was wondering about biotechnology for trying to break down these chemicals rather than a higher temperature of burning. Is anybody exploring that? That might be beyond the scope of this discussion, but certainly they're using it for oil cleanup, and it's a chemical, and bacteria can break things down.
Yeah, Gina, it's actually a really, really good idea. It is amazing, some of the technology. I was involved in the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Public Advisory Committee, and there's a lot of amazing technologies out there for breaking oil down. The thing that's tough about, because oil's naturally occurring, obviously. These PFAS chemicals are man-made, and they're called forever chemicals, and they do not break down very easily, even at high temperatures. If there is a way, Gina, for that type of technology to be used, that would be phenomenal. I have not read anything about it, but that doesn't mean that it's not an idea that couldn't be tried. So a lot of money to be made in figuring out how to break these down, and that's a great thought.
Could I ask a question online?
Yeah,
Sure.
go ahead.
Could you identify
Hi,
yourself, please, just so I know who you are?
My name is Pamela Troop. I am a local citizen here. Anyway, a couple of things. I'm from Parkersburg, West Virginia, and grew up in the area where DuPont was. In 1952 and 1954, there were documents that were found just a few years ago that indicated that this PFAS it caused cancer in animals, and there was kind of a rumor in the community I lived in. It was don't use Teflon. So it didn't come from any agency or DuPont itself. It came from the workers there. Above and beyond that, I have 12 relatives who my grandparents and my first cousins, not beyond that, who had cancer, and 9 of them died from it there. My ex-husband was working at DuPont when he died of cancer. But what I want to know right now is, has Golden Heart Utilities water been tested? And how can we as human beings be tested about the levels of PFAS in our systems? And have all the local ponds in the valley been tested?
Pamela, I'm sorry about the impacts to your relatives. It's a really sad story to hear, and kind of dumbfounding that as a country we didn't know the potential impacts of these chemicals until recently. So I appreciate that historical perspective. With respect to, and I'll try to address all the questions that you asked, with respect to the all the ponds, no, I don't think they've all been tested. The focus has been on the water bodies that are in proximity to areas where known AFFF application has occurred. So of course the on base that was easy, but sometimes areas where house fires or others, if they were on lakes, that may have impacted. I don't know. With respect to getting yourself tested, I have not heard that question before. I know that they are doing a study. They've identified, I think, 9 or 10 bases in the United States, one of them being Eielson, where PFAS exposure occurred, and they're going to be doing, the Center for Disease Control and ATSDR are going to be doing a study of the potential impacts to those soldiers, and trying to figure out what levels of PFAS are in their blood. I know that there's obviously also significant concern about the potential impacts to firefighters who may have been exposed to this on an ongoing basis. With respect to getting yourself tested, I don't know the answer to that, but obviously if they're testing these individuals, I'm sure that that it's possible. And again, like I said, I know that 99% of Americans do have PFAS in their systems. Pamela, I don't know if I answered all of your questions. I think I did, but if I missed any out, please repeat them.
Golden Heart Utilities, has the water from Golden Heart Utilities been tested?
Indeed. So the water coming in and out, my understanding is below the 70 parts per trillion. So my understanding is that they're fine.
Sir, this is Mike Meeks. I just sent a note to Orrin Paul, the CEO, and he says, yes, it's been tested and it's low.
Right. That was my understanding as well. So, and one thing that, they're obviously not injecting PFAS into their process. So it's coming from somewhere, and identifying where that is. I mean, it's coming from all of us. It's a wastewater treatment plant. So it's coming from the food we eat, the pans and the materials we use, and it's ending up obviously getting flushed down our toilets and accumulating at their, and this is, Golden Heart Utilities is not unique. This is a problem nationwide.
Right. No, I understand that. There's a documentary, and I'll shut up after this, and it's called The Devil We Know, and it was given to me by a friend, but I've been following this for quite some time on the internet because of my connection and my family that still lives there. And The Devil We Know, it goes back from the beginning, and it comes forward to, I think it was filmed in 2016 or 2017, and it's fascinating, and it's on Netflix or one of those. You can watch it.
Thank you, Pamela. So I have a few more slides. I don't know what time, Evan, that we go to, if it's till 9. I'll try to get through these. If you want to go a little longer, I have the time availability as well.
Yeah, I think it's usually an hour, but we can go a little longer.
Okay.
That's fine.
So most of what's on this slide already. I'm sorry.
I think we have a couple more questions real quick.
Okay.
Hi, Commissioner. This is Barbara with Rep. Wilson's office. So I just want to correct something that you said, is that you had said that Representative Wilson was pushing to have everything shipped out, but in fact she.
Oh, no. She was pushing to have a local contractor tried to use it. She was very smart in saying, hey, let's try to bring local jobs and try to address this issue locally. She was definitely not wanting to.
I just want to make sure that the people here knew that she'd been pushing for those burn permits with OIT pretty
Absolutely.
severely.
She was very proactive, and I was so excited with because that's one of my big mottos is local solutions for local problems. And Representative Wilson and I were in complete agreement with trying to find a local win for, provide jobs, solve this problem locally. And it was exciting to have that idea and to try to implement it. And the test burns happened, I believe, last week, and we're awaiting the results. So huge kudos to Representative Wilson.
Jason, this is Roger Burgraff.
Hi, Roger.
I have a good friend that lives off of Alston Road, and he came down with cancer, and quite a few people in his area had cancer. Now, I know it's been a problem that the city and also the state has been concerned about for quite a few years, and a lot of those areas that had high PFS they brought in water, which hopefully will remedy that problem. But it is something that is of real concern to our people up here and also the nation. And I'm not quite sure what evidently the product that they're producing is soluble and will go into the water. Now, certain areas that you talk that out at Alston where they've tested, they've made, they've talked about possibly trying to do a contaminated site deal where the contaminated soils would be put in a liner and not, be subject to further pollution. So I commend you and the state in, looking at this problem and trying to bring resolution to it. I don't know whether there's any product that can take the PFS and combine it with another product, another element in the soil. Like I know with cyanide, a lot of times the cyanide will combine with iron oxides and become non-lethal.
Well, Roger, I know that they're looking at all sorts of different treatments to try to get this out of the environment, and all ideas are on the table because they're not yet finding anything. Like I said, fortunately though, they do know that it's treatable in the water systems. You can use carbon filtration or reverse osmosis. So it's just obviously identification and knowledge is very powerful to making sure that you can address the problem. It's ubiquitous in our environment, and we the AFFF, which has been the significant exposure in Alaska. There's also a lot of research being done on alternatives to that. But let's be honest, the reason why AFFF is required is because it works so well to protect human lives and property. And for some, and I would be one of them, I'm willing to create a contaminated site to save someone's life. And that's a difficult decision and choice to have to make, but human life always takes precedent for me. And so alternatives technology has to be done, not just to try to figure out how to get rid of this in the environment, but also let's figure out alternatives to what we're using so that you can have such high quality products like are found in AFFF, but that don't have the environmental impact that they're having. Evan, are there other questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
This is Mike Kraft again. I heard about the human health issue, and I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and somebody pretty high up in government kind of pulled me to the side and said, hey, you know, off the cuff, by the way, don't eat the fish. Because I was talking about the fish in my gravel pit, and I hadn't considered that. And it was kind of like said to me in a way that was not meant for the public to hear. And I'm curious, are we at a point where we should be talking about the fish in Chino Lakes and the fish in the 150 or 200 gravel pits between Eielson Air Force Base and Fairbanks that people fish in every day? And, you know, they're pretty productive ponds. And I'm just curious, are we at a point where we need to make sure that the public is aware that potentially they're hurting themselves by eating locally caught fish in these ponds?
You know, Mike, I think that we don't know. We're focusing on the areas, Mike, that we know that there has been exposure for AFFF. I don't think that means that every single lake, every single gravel pond has had that kind of impact and subsequently is in the fish. You know, so I don't think it's I don't think it's something to totally panic about. I think in those areas where we know that there's been such application and such exposure, absolutely, it's the intelligent thing to do to go and get those fish tested. We've done that as a state. We found that there have been the PFAS levels have bioaccumulated in those fish, and we've closed those lakes to fishing. But you know, I can't speak to which specific gravel pits. But if you have concern, you know, I would urge you to get it tested, or to work with DEC.
Where would I get it tested at?
There are a number of labs, but you know, if you have specific, if you want to call me or call one of my team, I'm happy to put you in touch with the labs that are doing this testing.
All right, thank you.
So with respect to Alaska, with the airports, as I've indicated, we have done a risk matrix for all of the different airports that are state airports, and their location, the proximity to drinking wells. And we have two more that are slated for testing this summer, and that's in Antioch and Iliamna. There are a number of airports we have tested, fortunately, which have not had contamination of PFAS, in Kenai and Valdez. A few other communities have no PFAS contamination or very limited PFAS contamination. So there is some positive stories about that. But we are going to be looking at Antioch and Iliamna, and we have a matrix of others that we're looking at as well. As I indicated before, I mean, some of this is a broken record, but we have given immediately bottled water to those folks that have had contamination in the drinking wells. DOT has in proximity to the airports. Of course, Fairbanks has done this as well. When appropriate treatment systems or public water systems have been installed, as Mike indicated, and $4 to $5 million I know has been spent already by the community or by Fairbanks for providing alternative water. supply, so it's not cheap. I know that Fairbanks has recently gone into a class action lawsuit against the producers of these chemicals. But those, the water systems, obviously, and making sure that the people that are using the water are the first thing to make sure is covered. And then cleanup and monitoring of the fish and monitoring of the AFFF is high priority as well. Our future actions, obviously we're going to continue to monitor those airports where we've seen the exposure and identify potential other exposure pathways, working very closely with other responsible parties such as the Department of Defense and others. We're looking at the PFAS implementation plan very closely and holding EPA to its word that it's going to expeditiously move that forward. And as I said, this is an evolving issue that we are monitoring every day. The EPA plan that they came out with in 2019 does put draft groundwater cleanup recommendations for the two that we're looking at, PFOS and PFOA. As I indicated also, they're trying to determine whether they want to set MCLs or maximum contaminant levels for those two chemicals. They're developing lab test methods for media such as, other than drinking water. So for fish or wildlife or other things that we might be exposed to. They're determining whether or not they want to list those under CERCLA. And they're conducting toxicity studies so that they know that what they're doing would support setting risk-based levels. They're looking at the TSCA and whether new uses of PFAS should be allowed, and contemplating putting it in the TRI, the toxic release inventory. There is, as I indicated, significant nationwide concern about this PFAS issue. Alaska is not the only state that is impacted by PFAS. Every state is. But Alaska is ahead of the game. There are a number of states, as I indicated, 34 states, I believe, that are behind Alaska in what we're doing, that they haven't done anything. 16 states, I believe, are using the lifetime health advisory that Alaska is using, or they're more aggressive. Some of those states that are more aggressive are, of course, locations where the chemicals have been produced historically, or there's significant accumulation of them. Those include New Jersey and Minnesota and other states. Other states have adopted action levels for things other than the PFOA and PFOS, like Alaska has. Some of those include Gen X and other PFAS chemicals. As far as I know, only New Jersey is thus far proposing to have a state maximum contaminant level, and that's at 13 parts per trillion for PFOS and 14 parts per trillion for PFOA. And again, Alaska's combination is 70 parts per trillion. But most states have yet to take action on this, and I think this last slide that I have demonstrates that. You can see the states and the levels. Ours that we currently have on the regs are 400 parts per trillion. That's the 0.4 for cleanup levels, and then the 70 parts per trillion for the lifetime health advisory. And you can see what other states have implemented things, but most of the states have not. With that, that's my last slide. I'm happy to take additional questions, and I hope this was, I am by no means the expert on this issue. I have amazing folks that work with me. John Halverson is the head of the Contaminated Sites program. Denise Koch is the head of the SPAR program. She's the director of the SPAR program. They are phenomenal to work with. They are great if you have questions to call. We want to be a resource for Alaskans on this issue. We're also work very closely, as I indicated, with the folks at HES Health and Human Services, as well as Alaska Department of Fish and Game and the Department of Transportation. And so this is an issue we've spent significant amount of cabinet time discussing, wanting to make sure we're doing the right thing and not getting out ahead of the EPA, but at the same time, not having our head in the sand. So we are monitoring this very closely, and recommendations or comments or questions that those of you have, I'm happy to take them.
Thanks, Jason. I know we have one or two questions.
Yeah, Jason Clark again. The EPA set standards, but NIOSH is another credible federal, not agency, but outlet. Do you know if NIOSH has set any MCLs on PFAS?
I don't. I can
Okay.
look into that, but I don't know.
Right. I'm imagining we would have heard of it if they did, so they didn't. But the other thing too is with a lot of these types of compounds, do you know if there's a latency to the health effects? Namely, I think the reason that they're using these trillion part deals is because since they don't go away, they bioaccumulate, etc. Do you have a sense of whether that is partly potentially the cause of some of the late actions, you know, in terms of decades have passed since we started inoculating the environment? And most of the health effects, yes, they found some by doing some testing, but it may be at higher levels than parts per trillion. Do you have a sense on latency, whether the most serious things will take quite a while to show up?
Well, I mean, Clark, that's one of the reasons why this is such a difficult issue is there is really no smoking gun. There are epidemiological studies which are showing impacts that to people, and it's hard. It's hard to know specifically what impact this is having and at what levels the exposure has to be for it to significantly increase cancer rates or and so Clark, I know that the Center for Disease Control and ATSDR are very closely studying this issue about what levels the impacts to humans are for which specific PFAS chemicals, but there's so much emerging on this issue that it's hard to know specifically what the impacts are. And that really doesn't answer your question, but I can just tell you that it's an emerging issue and there's constant science that's being done to try to refine it further.
Yep, understood. It's large enough that it's still at the point of being confusing. Understood. Yep.
It beyond confusing, and no real smoking gun per se, other than they know that there are epidemiological links to these impacts. They just don't know to what extent. So.
Thank you.
Yep.
So I guess that brings up another question as far as, I don't know, prioritization. We have, as an example, PM 2.5 that we're trying to deal with as well. Does this seem more or less urgent than other environmental issues that we're facing?
I can tell you that it's a great question as well. For some that I've talked to, they feel no sense of urgency on this. They feel the science is not refined enough. For others, this is the most important environmental issue we should be dealing with. So it's finding that middle ground, like, that's really difficult. Obviously, for some in that room, the air quality issue is much more in your face. Like you can feel and smell the smoke on certain days. So that is to some a lot more relevant. But it's an issue that I'm spending a lot of my time on. I assure you that it's important to me and to this administration, and we're just making sure that we're not rushing to judgment and that we're evaluating the science and making appropriate decisions accordingly.
Commissioner Brune, this is Dan Bross with KUAC. given that EPA does not always adhere to its projected timelines, how long are you willing to wait on an in-state health advisory level that's lower than the 70?
Dan, it's a great question. We obviously expect the EPA to stick to their word of being done within the year, and we hope that that's the case. As new science is revealed and new information is presented, we obviously can make changes ourselves. And so we are constantly staying on top of the emerging information, the different information we're getting from ATSDR, from the Center for Disease Control, and from the EPA. And our hope, like I said, is that the EPA will stick to its word of getting done with this process within the year, and we won't have to be in that position of having to make a decision otherwise.
So if they don't, you'll reassess at year's end?
No question, absolutely.
And then one other question is there EPA involvement in this soil burning remediation project?
I have briefed the EPA on this issue. Yes, they are absolutely involved, and they're closely monitoring this because nationwide we're trying to figure out how to deal with this stuff. And
Alaska's the first in this approach?
You know, it's a good question. I don't know if we're the first. I know that we're one of the first, and they're watching it very closely.
Thank you.
Commissioner Brune, this is Seth Whitten from Rep. Thompson's office. You mentioned there's a private entity out at the Nordale Road area who was doing some testing for contamination out there. Was that initiated internally by that company? What sparked that inquiry?
Yep, Alyeska Pipeline did initiate the testing themselves as a responsible party. That is the process. They obviously had, I believe, identified areas where AFFF had been used, and they tested and found levels below the state's and the EPA's health advisory levels, but they did find that there was PFAS in the soil, but it was below the levels that were set.
And that's that 400 parts per trillion level?
It's below, my understanding is it's below the 70 parts per trillion health advisory level that the EPA has set and that the state has endorsed.
And groundwater? Was that also tested?
I believe so. I believe the soil and the groundwater. I will confirm that, but if I'm wrong, I will let Evan know. But my understanding is yes, they've tested both groundwater and the soil.
Thanks, Jason.
But they did not find levels that were of concern.
I think that's it for the questions, Jason. Thank you for the presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity. You all have a great day. My email is jason.brune@alaska.gov if you have more specific questions. And I'll look forward to seeing many of you in a couple of weeks when we're up there for the PM 2.5 open house and public hearing.
All right. Thanks, Jason. I'm going to take control and stop the share.
Perfect. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Barbara.
These dirty cups out.
You can just send them anywhere. I'll grab them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's easy.
I don't know what the technology is. Yeah, I'm trying to find out.